There are so many stories of Christmas, and I'd like to share a couple of them with you today. This one is one of the older stories, one that might sound familiar with you from days of your childhood, perhaps. In the days of King Herod of Judea, there lived a priest called Zechariah, and he had a wife, Elizabeth by name. Both were worthy in the sight of God and scrupulously observed all the commandments and observances of the Lord. But they were childless. Elizabeth was barren, and they were both getting on in years. Now Zechariah was exercising his priestly office when it fell to him by lot, as the ritual custom was, to enter the Lord's sanctuary and burn incense there. And at the hour of incense, the whole congregation stood outside and prayed. Then there appeared to him in the sanctuary the angel of the Lord, standing on the right side of the altar of incense. The sight disturbed Zechariah, and he was overcome with fear. But the angel said to him, "Zechariah, do not be afraid. Your prayers have been heard. Your wife Elizabeth is to bear you a son, and you must name him John, which means God is gracious. He will be your joy and delight, and many will rejoice at his birth, for he will be great in the sight of heaven." And Zechariah said to the angel, "How can I be sure of this? I'm an old man, and my wife is getting on in years too." And the angel replied, "I am Gabriel, who stands in God's presence, and I have been sent to you to bring you this good news. So listen. Since you have not believed my words, which will come true at their appointed time, you will be silenced and have no power of speech until this has happened." Meanwhile, the people were waiting for Zechariah and were surprised that he stayed in the sanctuary for so long a time. And when he came out, he could not speak to them, and they realized that he had received a vision in the sanctuary. But he could only make signs to them, and he remained mute. When his time of service came to an end, he returned home. And sometime later, his wife Elizabeth conceived, and for 5 months she kept to herself. "The Lord has done this for me," she said, "now that it has pleased him to take away the waiting." And thus ends the beginning of the story of John the Baptist. Rumplestiltskin, the Advent story. Now, I have to admit you may have heard this story quite differently than I'm going to tell it to you today, so please pay attention. His name was given partly in honor and partly in error, and neither one impressed the other children. I can hear them now, his peers, taunting him with his name in their high nasal voices, repeating over and over until it was both nonsense and ridicule. "Wrinkled pants and skinny legs, wrinkled pants and skinny legs," they called Rumplestiltskin. He had been named for his great-grandfather, who had been a tall, tall man with a deep, deep voice. Rumbler, they had called him for his gravelly baritone, and Stiltshins for his long, lower limbs. Rumbler, Stiltshins. In his language, it was an honor. But when the great-grandson emigrated and tried to translate the name in the new land's language, it became a curse for his son. That was the error. Rumplestiltskin, wrinkled pants and skinny legs. And the situation is not without irony. The boy who was given this tall, burdensome name in his family of heritage was born as a little person. Skinny legs, they called him after the long legs of his ancestor, but his were short and stubby. And his voice was no rumble either. Even into adulthood, he retained the lilt and pitch of a child. It was well that that part of the name hadn't survived translation. What must the sensitive child have suffered? For aren't all children sensitive? What must the sensitive child have endured for his name and his maladies? It is certain knowledge that he disdained his contemporaries. As a child, he was considered aloof. Who could blame him? As an adult, he was remote. He didn't need them, didn't need their taunts, didn't need their companionship. But, and more irony here, they needed him. Did they but know it? You see, many of the desired physical aspects that he lacked at his birth, but he arrived in this life with a singular gift. His was the gift of realizing transformation. If something terrible existed, he could transform it into something acceptable. Illness, he could change into good health. Fear into bravery. Himself he could not transform. But any malady of the soul or the psyche, any crisis of bad planning or braggadocio, these he could alter. There's a debate going on. It could be all right. I lost my place. He was clever, but he was not liked or understood because cleverness looked like magic. People feared him, and they envied him his gift. 5 years. And they could not forgive him his deformities. So he took himself and his aptitude into the forest. He answered only the most heartrending pleas for help, and he made it his habit to charge a painful price in recompense, and I suppose for his own pain. Now, the story you've heard about the tailor and his beautiful daughter, that is true. The wedding records have been verified. The king of the day did indeed marry the commoner daughter of a suit maker who was reputed to have been a braggart of the first degree. The people of the area insist to this day that he did indeed claim that his girl child could spin straw into gold, and the king believed him because he wanted to. Thus she was locked into a room full of dried stems, and she wept inconsolably. So the little man came to her. Now, there is no witness to the magic. I mean, did he actually spin straw and transform it into a precious metal? Or did he perhaps pull up a large truck, sweep out the room, and sprinkle a few coins he already had in his possession? We'll never know. So why argue the point? What is more important is the real transformation that occurred after he dried the tears of the wailing daughter. What is more magical, more miraculous, more mysterious even, than the creation of precious metal from baser elements are the changes that occurred after the king entered the chamber in the morning and found to his delight that his fodder had been turned into funds. The young commoner was transformed into a queen. The child was transformed into a wife. The virgin was transformed into a mother. Oh, I know these things, they happen every day. But they are great miracles, friends, if we would but acknowledge them. But they do not happen easily. They are the result of fearful waiting and dread anticipation. Recall, if you have it in your memory, you were waiting for the wedding day, the nervousness, the concern that something would go wrong. And remember, if you have it in your own storyline, the long sanding of two souls rubbing one another raw and then smooth until they are transformed from rough lovers into graceful mates. And imagine, if you do not already know, the growing anticipation of birth and the miracle of creation that converts one from careless individual to proud and protective parent. If these aren't miracles, I ask you, then what are? But I digress. It is the preacher's prerogative to do so, but our story is not done. There is yet the price to be paid. As I study on the life and the philosophy of the little man with the big name, I am not surprised that he asks for the firstborn child. Without a mate of his own, and where would he find one living in the forest, he must have had cravings for some kind of companionship. Perhaps another person who would not laugh at his length or his label. One who would appreciate his cleverness for what it was and not be afraid of it or envious. He asked the price, and the Queen Mother believed that she had to pay it. She had not been brought up to fend for herself, and so once again she fell back once again, the dwarf's heart was slightly softened. Or possibly he saw another opportunity for another transformation. Let her suffer, he might have thought. Let her wait. Let her work on herself. That may have indeed have been what he was thinking. Tell me my name, he said to her, and you can keep the brat. He was already steeling himself for the possibility of losing the child. Within 3 days, he said, if you can guess my name, which hasn't been spoken aloud for years, I will mark your account paid in full. But don't count on my services ever again if that happens. Well, the first 2 days, as you've heard, she sent out a messenger to seek someone who may have heard the dwarf's name long ago. And while the servant was gone, she paced the chambers, waiting for his return. Waiting and waiting to hear his report. She held her child and she wept, waiting as any mother weeps and waits for all the days of her child's life that she cannot control. But nothing. No name. On the 3rd day, she could wait no more. She took the search into her own hands. Strapping the baby into her shawl, she went down to the newspaper office and asked to see the birth announcements for the past 50 years. She wasn't helpless after all. Another transformation. She found the stories of his parents' shame, the stories of his being named valedictorian of his class but not showing up for the graduation, the stories of his endless transformations, obviously quite overtold in the newspaper, and the stories of his ultimate disappearance into the forest. And she discovered his name, Rumplestiltskin. But the name isn't the important part of the story. It's just his name, given partly in honor and partly in error. The name isn't always the thing. Sometimes it's just a plot device. This story is about transformation, how the helpless, hapless lass became a strong and self-reliant person for the sake of her babe, and how the waiting and worrying transformed her into a do-something mama. And the ending isn't the important part of the story either, but just to clear up any misunderstandings, Rumplestiltskin did not stamp through the floor in anger when she told him his name. He just smiled his most ironic smile and threw up his hands as if to say, that's life. The transformed queen mother didn't let it end there, for she had become more wise in her tribulations. She invited the little man to visit whenever he wished. She saw to it that the child appreciated him, and she watched that appreciation blossom into affection and love over the years. She watched the child transformed into a self-sufficient adult she could be proud of, and she watched the little man be transformed into the loving person that had dwelled in his heart all along and would have been his natural destiny, but for the silly name and the short legs. So that's the story of Rumplestiltskin. Not even an original story, but an important Christmas story. Because his name might have been Buddha, or his name might have been Jesus, or even Kuan Yin, or the name of any number of people who have been given the gift of transformation. It is not part of the story. I mean, this is not just a story. It is a teaching, a bit of fact, a generosity of exaggeration, a spicing of fancy, a hint of magic. It is also the story of Shirley waiting for Christmas. And it is the story of Elizabeth waiting in her old age for a child. It is the story of a weary world waiting for a sign or a savior. It is the story of innocence versus experience. And it is, as I said, a story of transformation. It is not history. It is not sociology. It is not psychology. Mostly, it is simply a story of the human condition, about the possibility of miracles, and about the inevitability of waiting. Waiting for what is good, waiting for what you desire, waiting for what you need, or just waiting for what will come. We've examined the story of Rumplestiltskin as I had promised, but I want to add some examination of other stories of this Advent season, The stories of the births of the one who was named John the Baptist and another who was called Jesus of Nazareth. Zechariah and Elizabeth did not call upon the services of a dwarf. They wept in the privacy of their home and they prayed. They waited agonizingly as their biological clocks ticked away. Elizabeth waited in the special embarrassment that was the lot of women in those days who did not bear children. Their prayers were heard in the soft heart of an angel named Gabriel, who was the agent of their transformation. And they paid the price of the gift with silence for Zechariah and with seclusion for Elizabeth. Mary and Joseph played the waiting game as well. What child is this, and whose? Where shall we go? Who will know us? What is to become of us? Will the king kill our child, or will the heavens preserve him? All the questions that all of us have asked, they asked. What will happen next? What will this life be about? And there is no answer. There is no answer except in the waiting, and in the loss of innocence, and in the naming of the event. But the story, the teaching story of the birth of Jesus has even more import than this. See it for what it is, a new story, and a day and time when the old stories were quite different than they are today. Barbara Rohde, in her meditation manual titled In the Simple Morning Light, notes that the remarkable thing about the Christmas story is the change it represents in human thought. It is a story not about the God of jealousy and anger, but a God who leads a humble young woman and the long months of patient waiting and the human process of birth to bring divinity into the world. Imagine, she writes, that after years of hearing story after story of men and women bowing abjectly before the might of kings and emperors, tsars, dictators, chieftains, and tyrants, you suddenly hear a story in which 3 kings kneel before a tiny child in praise of possibility. Possibility. That's the story of the Christmas season. And possibility is the zygote of transformation. It is the union of potential and of hope. It is the long confinement of dreaming, the painful birth of change. It is innocence arriving out of experience. It is innocence born in experience that dies. So do you see now what this season is all about? You understand what comes of all this waiting and the stress of anticipation. Do you understand the symbolism of transforming straw into gold, or birthing babies in a pile of straw? I ask you, friends, do not be impatient with the old stories. They may seem trivial at times in their unchanging repetitions year after weary year. They may seem tedious in their demands on our credulity. A virgin birth? Who could believe it? Gold out of straw? Who could believe that? A first child in old age? Who could believe it? Visits by dwarves, visits by angels, gifts from kings, stars that beckon. Who could believe any of it? But I ask you this. Believe it. Believe it in innocence, for innocence is full of what might be when experience is used up and empty. Believe it in anticipation, when waiting is hard and you need something to hold on to. Believe it in laughter and believe it in tears, for stories are the repositories of our sorrows and our happiness, and all of them are true, even the made-up ones. Believe in this season of Advent. In the waiting will be born your tomorrows and your transformations. Believe that you must pay a terrible price for such a gift. Pay with the fear of unknowing, pay with pain of letting go of the past, pay with praise, and pay with thanksgiving. Believe it and make reparation the only way that you can, by living your life well. And while you wait, remember that this day is the day you waited for yesterday. This is the day that has come to you, newborn and innocent with possibility. Take this day and go to the school of life. Go and learn how to unlearn. Speak out the name of whatever angel blesses you. Shout out the name of the dwarf who mocks you. Name the fears and name the blessings, and wait for tomorrow with all your heart. Please stand now as you're willing and able to sing our final hymn, number 226.